I want to begin at the point where everything finally made sense, even though it hurt to breathe. At the time, I was weeks away from my wedding, standing in the quiet of our living room with a mug of tea growing cold in my hands, and I realized that the two people I had organized my life around had organized a lie around me. My fiancé, the man I had chosen with care, patience, and hope, and my best friend, the woman who knew my history, my fears, and the way I steady myself when the world feels uncertain, had slept together. Not once. Not by accident. Repeatedly, deliberately, and with a confidence that told me they believed I would never find out. I didn't discover this through a dramatic confrontation or a whispered confession. There were no raised voices or slammed doors. The truth arrived quietly, almost politely, which in hindsight feels fitting. Betrayal rarely announces itself. It waits for the moment you're too busy trusting to look closely. What I knew immediately, even as my heart struggled to keep a steady rhythm, was that whatever came next would not be loud or impulsive. It would be measured. And it would end where they least expected it to. At the wedding they were so comfortable planning with me. At that point, I was a woman in my 30s who believed in choosing her reactions carefully. I had learned, through years of work and relationships, that chaos doesn't heal anything. Clarity does. So when the reality of their manipulation settled over me like a heavy coat, I did what I have always done when faced with a problem that demands precision. I paused. I listened. I watched. And I decided that the truth, presented calmly and publicly, would be the most honest response I could offer. To understand why the wedding mattered, you need to know what it represented to me. This wasn't a fairy tale fantasy or a performance for social media. It was a promise I had taken seriously. I had spent years building a stable, intentional life, steady career, carefully chosen friendships, a home that felt like refuge rather than display. When I agreed to marry him, it was because he seemed to fit into that life without disturbing its balance. And when I asked her to stand beside me as my maid of honor, it was because she had already stood beside me through grief, career disappointments, and the quieter victories that don't make good stories but shape a person all the same. That's what made the betrayal so clean, and so cruel. There were no visible cracks, no public arguments, no whispered rumors reaching my ears. They moved through my days with ease. He kissed my cheek before work. She texted me reminders about florist appointments. They sat across from each other at dinner tables and discussed seating charts while sharing a secret that reduced my entire future to a joke between them. And they did it with the assurance of people who believe they are smarter than everyone else in the room. I remember thinking, in those first moments after I knew, how strange it was that my body reacted before my mind fully caught up. A cold, deliberate stillness settled into my chest, as if my instincts were stepping forward to take control. My hands didn't shake. My vision didn't blur. Instead, I felt a precise awareness sharpen my thoughts. Every conversation I had replayed itself with new meaning. Every smile became a calculation. It wasn't rage that filled me. It was resolve. What I want to be very clear about is this. I did not immediately decide on revenge. That word suggests something emotional, something impulsive. What I decided on was truth and timing. I knew that confronting them privately would give them what they wanted, control over the narrative, the chance to minimize, deny, or recast themselves as misunderstood. I had spent enough years navigating professional environments to recognize manipulation when I saw it. And this was a textbook case of people who relied on secrecy to maintain their advantage. The wedding, I realized, was the center of that secrecy. It was the place where appearances mattered most, where families, friends, and carefully constructed images converged. It was also the place where they felt safest. After all, who would expect a bride to dismantle her own ceremony? Who would imagine that a woman who had invested time, money, and emotion into an event would willingly expose the very people she had chosen to honor? That assumption, that I would prioritize comfort over truth, was their greatest mistake. As I stood there, letting the weight of what I knew settle fully, I understood something else too. This story was not about humiliation for its own sake. It was about justice. About allowing their own choices to speak for themselves, without embellishment or theatrics. I didn't need to exaggerate what they had done. The facts, presented clearly, would be enough. Betrayal loses its power when it is stripped of secrecy and forced into the open. So this is where my story begins, not with shouting or tears, but with a quiet decision made in a living room filled with wedding planning folders and unearned trust. I chose not to unravel. I chose to observe. And I chose to let the truth arrive exactly where it belonged, carried by their own actions, at a moment they believed was designed to celebrate loyalty. They never expected what I revealed at the wedding. And that, perhaps, is the most honest summary of what happens when two-faced people underestimate the strength of someone they thought was easy to deceive. Looking back now, with distance and perspective, what unsettles me most is not that the betrayal happened, but how ordinary everything looked while it was unfolding. My life, on the surface, was calm and well-ordered. I had reached a stage where I valued stability over excitement and consistency over grand gestures. I wasn't chasing a whirlwind romance or dramatic friendships. I had deliberately chosen people who felt safe, predictable in the best way, and aligned with the future I wanted to build. I saw myself then as reasonable, thoughtful, and fair. I worked hard, paid my bills on time, and believed deeply in showing up for the people I loved. I was the kind of person who remembered birthdays without reminders, who checked in when someone went quiet, who believed that loyalty was something you practiced daily, not something you talked about when it was convenient. Trust, to me, wasn't blind. It was earned through years of shared experience. Or so I thought. My fiancé fit neatly into that world. We met later in life, not in our impulsive 20s, but at a point where both of us claimed to know who we were. He was attentive, charming in a gentle way, and very good at saying the right things at the right time. He listened when I spoke, or at least he appeared to. He admired my independence and often told me how much he respected my judgment. I took that at face value. In hindsight, I can see how much he relied on admiration and validation, how easily he leaned toward anyone who offered him uncomplicated praise. At the time, I interpreted his need to be liked as kindness. My best friend had been part of my life far longer. We had met years before, through work, and our friendship had survived job changes, relationships, and long stretches of daily life where nothing dramatic happened. She knew my routines, my family history, the way I retreat inward when I'm overwhelmed. I trusted her with information I didn't share easily, old disappointments, private fears, the parts of myself that don't show up in polite conversation. She had been there when I questioned whether marriage was even something I wanted, listening patiently as I weighed independence against companionship. When I became engaged, she was the first person I told. She cried, hugged me, and insisted she would help with everything. She took on the role of maid of honor with enthusiasm that I mistook for generosity. She volunteered to coordinate vendors, manage schedules, and smooth over minor family tensions. I was grateful. In my mind, this was what close friendship looked like. Someone stepping in to share the load without being asked. Our normal world revolved around planning and anticipation. There were weekend brunches spent discussing color palettes, evenings reviewing guest lists, casual conversations about where we might go for our honeymoon. My fiancé and my best friend seemed to get along effortlessly. They laughed easily together, shared similar tastes in music, and often agreed on details I hadn't given much thought to. At first, I felt relieved by this harmony. It made everything feel simpler. The warning signs were there, though subtle enough to dismiss. There were moments when conversations stopped abruptly as I entered the room. Text messages that arrived late at night, brushed off as logistical updates. A sense that decisions were being made just before I was informed of them, always framed as help rather than control. When I raised small concerns, both of them responded quickly and reassuringly. I was told I was stressed, overwhelmed, imagining problems that didn't exist. And because I wanted peace, I accepted those explanations. I see now how carefully they cultivated that dynamic. My best friend positioned herself as indispensable, always available, always supportive, always just a little more involved than necessary. My fiancé leaned into her presence, enjoying the ease of someone who expected nothing from him except charm. Together, they created an environment where questioning anything felt unnecessary, even ungrateful. It's remarkable how manipulation can masquerade as kindness when everyone involved plays their role convincingly. What hurts, even now, is remembering how I defended them to others. If someone hinted that my best friend seemed overly involved, I laughed it off. If a family member commented on how close she and my fiancé appeared, I explained it away as maturity and trust. I believed that choosing not to be jealous or suspicious was evidence of emotional growth. I didn't want to be the woman who doubted her own circle. I wanted to believe that the life I had built was grounded in mutual respect. There was also an imbalance I didn't recognize at the time. I was the planner, the organizer, the one carrying responsibility. They floated comfortably within the structure I created. I paid deposits, managed timelines, coordinated schedules. They praised my efficiency, thanked me for keeping everything together. What I didn't see was how that positioned me as the stable backdrop against which their secrecy could thrive. I was so focused on making things work that I didn't notice how little effort they were putting into protecting me. In quiet moments, there was a feeling I couldn't quite name. A sense of being slightly outside my own life, observing rather than participating fully. I attributed it to wedding stress, to the pressure of balancing work and planning. I told myself that discomfort was temporary, that once the wedding passed, everything would settle. That assumption, that endurance would eventually be rewarded, kept me from asking harder questions. The truth is, my normal world was built on the belief that the people closest to me shared my values. Loyalty, honesty, care. I believed those were mutual foundations, not personal ideals I carried alone. My fiancé and my best friend understood those values well enough to perform them convincingly. That performance was polished, consistent, and deeply deceptive. If there's one thing I wish I could tell the woman I was then, it's this: discomfort is not always a sign of stress. Sometimes it's intuition struggling to be heard over politeness and habit. The first warning signs aren't dramatic. They're quiet moments where something feels slightly off, and you talk yourself out of listening because acknowledging it would require change. That was the world I lived in before the line was crossed. A world where trust was assumed, roles were clearly defined, and I believed I was surrounded by people who wanted the same future I did. It felt safe. It felt earned. And it made what came next not just shocking, but clarifying in a way that would change how I understood loyalty forever. The moment that changed everything did not arrive with drama or noise. There was no confrontation, no overheard argument, no anonymous message sent with cruel intentions. It came quietly, disguised as an ordinary inconvenience, which somehow made it feel more unsettling. I was at home on a weekday evening, finishing up work emails, when my laptop battery died. Without thinking much of it, I reached for the tablet my fiancé and I occasionally shared for travel bookings and streaming. It was charged, close by, and familiar. At that point, there was no suspicion guiding my hand. Just habit. When I opened it, a message notification appeared across the top of the screen. It wasn't addressed to me. It was from my best friend. The preview alone was enough to make me pause. It wasn't explicit, but it was intimate in a way that immediately felt wrong. My first instinct was to close it, to respect privacy, to assume there was an explanation I didn't yet understand. I told myself it was probably about wedding stress or a surprise they were planning. That reflex, to protect the people I loved from scrutiny, was still firmly in place. But then another notification appeared. And another. Each one made my chest tighten just slightly more than the last. There was a tone there I recognized, a familiarity that didn't belong to me. My name wasn't mentioned once. Instead, there were jokes, casual references, and an ease that suggested a conversation well underway. My heart didn't race. It slowed. That was the first sign that something fundamental had shifted. I sat down at the kitchen table before opening anything further. I remember the surface was cool beneath my palms, grounding in a way I didn't yet understand I would need. When I finally tapped into the message thread, I did so deliberately, telling myself that whatever I found, I would read it once, carefully, and then decide what to do next. I didn't scroll frantically. I didn't skim. I read. What unfolded was not a single mistake or a moment of weakness. It was a pattern. Weeks of messages. Carefully arranged meetings. References to hotel rooms, shared jokes about my wedding plans, comments about how easy it was to keep everything separate. There were moments where they discussed me directly, not with guilt, but with amusement. One message, in particular, settled into my memory with uncomfortable clarity. My best friend joked about standing beside me at the altar, knowing what she knew. My fiancé responded with a laughing emoji and a remark about how clueless I was. That was the moment the line was crossed. Not when I realized they had slept together, but when I understood the depth of their contempt. Betrayal is painful enough when it's rooted in weakness or confusion. This was something else entirely. This was entitlement. They believed they were smarter than me, more deserving than me, and immune to consequence. They believed I existed on the periphery of their real lives, useful for appearances and stability, but ultimately irrelevant. I closed the tablet and sat very still. There was no urge to cry, no desire to scream. Instead, a quiet, almost clinical awareness took over. I began mentally cataloging details, dates, locations, names. I noted how long it had been going on, how carefully it had been hidden, how confidently they had continued to involve me in their plans. The wedding timeline suddenly rearranged itself in my mind, not as a celebration, but as a framework. A structure they had relied on. A structure I could use. What struck me most in those first moments was how little they seemed to fear discovery. They hadn't deleted messages. They hadn't been careful about syncing devices. They operated under the assumption that I would never look, never question, never disrupt the narrative they had constructed. That assumption told me everything I needed to know about how they saw me. Not as an equal. Not as someone capable of decisive action. But as a constant, reliable, predictable, and easily managed. I didn't confront them that night. I didn't mention what I had seen. Instead, I observed. Over the next few days, I watched their behavior with a clarity that surprised me. Every smile, every affectionate gesture, every reassuring comment felt rehearsed. My fiancé talked about our future with ease, making plans, discussing logistics, completely untroubled by the fact that his words were hollow. My best friend checked in constantly, asking how I was feeling, offering help, positioning herself as my closest ally. The duplicity was almost impressive in its consistency. There was one moment, a few days later, that confirmed my decision to stay silent. We were all together, reviewing seating arrangements. My best friend suggested a minor change, placing herself closer to us at the head table. She framed it as practical, something that would make speeches easier. My fiancé agreed immediately. They exchanged a glance that lasted just a fraction of a second too long. It was subtle, but now that I knew what to look for, it was unmistakable. They weren't just hiding something. They were enjoying it. That was when I understood that confronting them privately would achieve nothing meaningful. They would deny, minimize, apologize without sincerity, and find a way to reposition themselves as victims of circumstance. They would rely on my instinct to avoid conflict, on my desire to handle things quietly, and they would continue, in some form, to escape accountability. I had seen enough to know how that story would end. Instead, I began to think about fairness, about proportion, about consequences that matched actions. I wasn't interested in vengeance fueled by anger. I was interested in balance. They had chosen secrecy. The appropriate response was exposure. They had relied on my silence. The appropriate response was clarity. And they had used the wedding, a public affirmation of loyalty, as camouflage for betrayal. That, I realized, was where accountability belonged. In the days that followed, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The uncertainty was gone. The questions had answers now, even if those answers were painful. I moved through my routines with purpose, making notes, saving copies, documenting what I had already seen and what I might need later. I reminded myself often to breathe evenly, to keep my voice steady, to maintain the composure they assumed I lacked. The line, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. But it can clarify everything that comes after. That discovery didn't just reveal what my fiancé and best friend had done. It revealed who they were when they believed no one was watching. And in that realization, as heavy as it was, I found something unexpectedly solid to stand on. From that point forward, nothing they did surprised me. And that gave me the space to decide not just how the story would end, but how it would be told. Once the truth settled into place, something unexpected happened inside me. The shock faded, but my awareness sharpened. I moved through the days that followed with a quiet attentiveness, as though I had stepped slightly outside my own life and was now observing it from a distance. I didn't change my behavior abruptly. I laughed when expected, answered questions about the wedding, and continued my routines. Outwardly, everything remained calm. Inwardly, I was taking careful notes. What became clear very quickly was that instead of pulling back or showing guilt, they grew bolder. It was as though my silence reassured them that their deception was flawless. My fiancé became almost buoyant, more affectionate than usual, more vocal about our future. He spoke often about how lucky he felt, how solid our relationship was, how excited he was to finally be married. Each declaration landed with a strange hollowness. His confidence wasn't rooted in love. It was rooted in the belief that he was untouchable. My best friend followed a similar pattern. She checked in constantly, asking if I was overwhelmed, if I needed help, if there was anything she could take off my plate. Her tone was warm, concerned, almost maternal at times. But now I could hear what sat beneath it. Control. She wanted to remain essential. She wanted access. She positioned herself as my emotional anchor, all while quietly undermining me. When I hesitated or appeared distracted, she framed it as stress, gently suggesting I rest more and let her handle things. It was gaslighting dressed up as care. The more they doubled down on their performance, the more the stakes escalated. Wedding payments were finalized. Contracts were signed. My fiancé encouraged me to move shared finances fully into joint accounts for simplicity. He spoke about merging assets with casual ease, never once acknowledging the risk he was asking me to take. I agreed to nothing new, offering vague reassurances instead. I told him I wanted to wait until after the honeymoon to make major financial changes. He accepted that answer easily, which told me he wasn't worried. He believed time was on his side. Socially, they became increasingly comfortable. They laughed together openly, shared stories, and referenced inside jokes I wasn't part of. When I noticed, my best friend was quick to smooth things over, explaining that they'd just been coordinating details or reminiscing about something harmless. If I asked a follow-up question, she smiled and asked if I was feeling anxious. The implication was always the same. Any discomfort was my issue to manage. There were moments when their confidence tipped into carelessness. Once, I walked into a room unexpectedly and caught my fiancé mid-sentence, lowering his voice as soon as he saw me. Another time, my best friend sent me a message clearly meant for him, quickly followed by an apology and a laughing remark about being so scatterbrained lately. Each incident alone might have seemed insignificant. Together, they formed a pattern of arrogance. They no longer felt the need to be careful. What struck me most was how they seemed to feed off each other's certainty. One would reassure the other that everything was fine, that I was happy, that I trusted them completely. They reinforced the narrative they wanted to believe. In doing so, they escalated their own downfall. Every step they took to tighten their control also left more evidence behind. More messages. More assumptions. More leverage. I could see clearly now that I wasn't emotionally entangled in their story. I noticed how my best friend began to assert herself more in decisions that didn't concern her. She spoke on my behalf to vendors. She made suggestions that positioned herself more prominently during the ceremony. She even asked, casually, if she could give a longer speech than planned, mentioning how much she had been there for us. The entitlement was unmistakable. She wasn't just hiding an affair. She was rehearsing a role in which she emerged blameless, admired, and indispensable. My fiancé, meanwhile, became impatient with anything that slowed progress. He pushed for final confirmations, encouraged me to stop double-checking details, and dismissed my questions with gentle condescension. "You're overthinking it," he would say, smiling. "Everything's handled." What he meant was that everything was handled in a way that benefited him. He didn't see my caution as wisdom. He saw it as an inconvenience. Throughout this period, I felt a steady resolve settle deeper into me. Each escalation from them confirmed that staying silent was the right choice. If I had confronted them early, they would have recalibrated, hidden better, and softened the narrative. By allowing them to continue, I was letting their own actions build the case against them. I wasn't collecting ammunition out of spite. I was allowing the truth to fully reveal itself. There were nights when I lay awake, listening to my fiancé breathe beside me, wondering how easily he slept. I didn't feel anger so much as disbelief. Not at the affair itself, but at the ease with which they dismissed my humanity. They had reduced me to a role, the stable partner, the trusting friend, the woman who would keep things running while they took what they wanted. That realization hardened something in me. It also clarified my purpose. By doubling down, they removed any lingering doubt I might have had. They weren't remorseful. They weren't conflicted. They were comfortable. And comfort, when built on manipulation, has a way of collapsing under its own weight. They believed the wedding was the finish line, the point after which everything would be locked in place. I began to see it differently. To me, it was becoming the moment where their certainty would finally meet consequence. As the days passed, I continued to play my part quietly, nodding, agreeing, smiling when appropriate. But beneath that calm surface, a shift had already occurred. I was no longer reacting to what they did. I was watching them reveal exactly how far they were willing to go. And with each new step they took, the path forward became clearer, narrower, and impossible for them to avoid. For a while, I told myself that what I was doing, watching, waiting, staying silent, was simply a way to protect myself. But there is a difference between patience and endurance, and I learned where that line was drawn on an afternoon that seemed, on the surface, entirely ordinary. It was one of those moments that doesn't announce its importance until much later, when you realize something inside you has shifted permanently. We were at a small cafe, the three of us, taking a break from errands. My best friend had suggested it, insisting we all needed a pause from wedding logistics. She spoke with the authority of someone who felt entitled to manage not just details, but emotions. As we sat there, cups cooling between us, the conversation drifted easily. Vendors, family travel plans, trivial complaints about seating arrangements. I listened, nodded, and waited. Then she laughed, leaning back in her chair with a casual confidence that made my stomach tighten. She said, almost offhandedly, that she was glad everything was finally coming together because, as she put it, once the wedding's over, things always get complicated. She glanced at my fiancé as she said it. He smiled back at her, not the polite smile one gives a friend, but something warmer, more familiar. The look passed quickly, but it was unmistakable. I felt it then, a cold, unmistakable certainty. They weren't just hiding what they had done. They were already planning for what came after. In that single exchange, I saw how they imagined the future. Me as a transitional figure, a necessary step toward stability, something to move through rather than build with. I was part of the arrangement, not the destination. A few minutes later, my best friend turned to me and asked, with that same practiced warmth, whether I would mind if she gave a longer speech at the reception. She said she wanted to talk about everything we've been through together and how proud she was of us. The audacity of it almost took my breath away. She wasn't asking out of sentiment. She was claiming space. She wanted to stand in front of our families and friends and rewrite history in her favor, all while knowing exactly what she had done. My fiancé supported the idea immediately. He said it would be nice for everyone to hear how close we all were. He reached for my hand as he spoke, squeezing it gently, as if that gesture alone could erase the duplicity behind his words. In that moment, I understood that neither of them felt any fear. They believed the story was theirs to shape. They believed I would continue to absorb discomfort quietly, the way I always had. That was the breaking point. Not the affair itself, not even the mocking messages I had read days earlier, but the realization that they saw no reason to stop. There was no guilt slowing them down, no hesitation forcing them to reconsider. They were comfortable enough to discuss the future in front of me, to make plans that required my continued cooperation, my continued silence. They had crossed from deception into entitlement, and that distinction matters. As we left the cafe, I felt a steady calm replace the lingering disbelief. The indecision I had been carrying evaporated. I no longer wondered if revealing the truth was necessary. I knew it was. Not because I wanted to hurt them, but because allowing them to continue would mean participating in my own erasure. I had spent too many years building a life grounded in self-respect to surrender it quietly now. That evening, alone at home, I replayed the conversation in my mind. I paid attention to the way they spoke about the future, about me, about the wedding. I recognized the pattern clearly. They were positioning themselves as central, confident that I would remain peripheral. They underestimated the significance of my silence, mistaking it for weakness rather than deliberation. I remember standing in the shower, letting the water run longer than necessary, thinking about how often women are expected to be accommodating even in the face of profound betrayal. We are taught to manage discomfort gracefully, to avoid making scenes, to prioritize harmony over honesty. I realized then that what they were counting on wasn't my love or my trust. It was my compliance. And that was something I could no longer offer. The decision wasn't dramatic. There was no internal monologue filled with anger or vows of revenge. It was quieter than that. Firmer. I decided that I would no longer protect their reputations at the expense of my own dignity. I decided that if there was going to be fallout, it would be proportional and unavoidable. And I decided that the moment of reckoning would happen on my terms, not theirs. By the time I stepped out of the shower, wrapped in a towel, hair dripping onto the tile floor, the plan wasn't fully formed, but the intention was. I would not confront them privately. I would not beg for honesty or explanations. I would allow them to continue exactly as they were, believing they were in control, while I prepared for the moment when that illusion would collapse. That afternoon at the cafe was the last time I felt uncertain. After that, everything became very clear. They had shown me who they were when they believed there were no consequences. And in doing so, they made my next steps not only possible, but necessary. Once the decision was made, truly made, my mind shifted into a familiar mode. I have always been someone who responds to chaos by organizing it. Emotion gives way to structure. Fear becomes lists, timelines, and contingencies. It wasn't that the pain disappeared. It was still there, heavy and persistent, but it no longer controlled me. Instead, it sharpened my focus. I didn't wake up one morning with a fully formed plan. What I had was clarity about one essential truth. The wedding itself was the center of their deception. It was the stage on which they performed loyalty while betraying it privately. It was also the one place where appearances mattered more to them than anything else. That realization didn't come with excitement or satisfaction. It came with a calm understanding of leverage. I began by reviewing everything I already knew. I went back to the messages I had seen, this time not as a wounded partner but as an observer. I noted dates, locations, and patterns. I saw how their communication intensified whenever I was busy or traveling for work. I saw how carefully they coordinated their availability around my schedule. This wasn't spontaneous. It was methodical. And that meant it could be documented. Quietly, carefully, I started preserving evidence. I took screenshots and saved copies in multiple places, naming files clearly and neutrally. There was no emotional language attached to them, just facts. Dates, times, locations. I included hotel confirmations, message threads, and voice notes they had sent each other without realizing how revealing they were. I made sure everything could stand on its own without explanation. If someone unfamiliar with our lives looked at it, the truth would still be unmistakable. At the same time, I began protecting myself financially and legally. I didn't announce these steps. I simply slowed things down. When my fiancé suggested finalizing joint accounts, I delayed. When he asked about consolidating assets after the wedding, I said I wanted to revisit the conversation later. I scheduled a quiet consultation with a lawyer under the pretense of reviewing prenuptial considerations. I didn't frame it as a crisis. I framed it as due diligence. That meeting was pivotal. Sitting across from someone who viewed the situation without emotional attachment helped me see the landscape clearly. We discussed annulment laws, financial protections, and what could and could not be reclaimed depending on timing. I learned which steps I needed to take before the wedding to protect myself fully. Knowledge, I discovered, is a powerful stabilizer. Each answer replaced anxiety with intention. As the practical framework took shape, I turned my attention to the social dynamics of the wedding itself. I thought carefully about who would be present, what assumptions they would bring with them, and how information would travel once released. I didn't want chaos. I wanted clarity. I wanted the truth to be undeniable, not debated or diluted. That meant controlling the narrative, not through emotion, but through timing and presentation. The idea of using the wedding as the moment of revelation didn't feel cruel. It felt appropriate. They had chosen that setting as camouflage for their betrayal. They had relied on the social pressure of the event to protect them. In doing so, they had handed me the very tool they thought would keep me silent. The irony of that wasn't lost on me, even then. I began coordinating discreetly with the people responsible for logistics. I spoke to the venue coordinator under the guise of planning a surprise element for the reception. I worked with the DJ to ensure I would have access to the microphone and screen at a specific moment. I didn't overshare. I didn't hint at drama. I simply made sure that when the time came, I wouldn't be interrupted or redirected. Everything was framed as part of the program. What surprised me most during this phase was how calm I felt. There was no rush, no panic. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was preparing. Each step reinforced the sense that I was reclaiming agency over a situation where it had been quietly taken from me. I slept better than I had in weeks. The constant low-level anxiety that had shadowed me since the discovery began to lift. Meanwhile, they continued exactly as before. My best friend offered support, checked in frequently, and spoke about the wedding with pride. She mentioned her speech again, refining ideas, talking about emotional moments she wanted to highlight. I listened politely, asked neutral questions, and stored away each assumption she made about how the day would unfold. My fiancé remained relaxed, affectionate, and entirely unaware of how much control he had already lost. There was one moment, late one evening, when I almost questioned myself. I was sitting alone, reviewing the evidence one last time, when a familiar doubt surfaced. Was this too much? Was I being unnecessarily public? That question lingered until I asked myself another one. What outcome would protect my dignity without protecting their deception? The answer was immediate and clear. Silence would only serve them. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about alignment. Their public image did not match their private behavior, and that imbalance needed correction. I wasn't adding anything to the story. I wasn't exaggerating. I was simply allowing their own words and actions to be seen by the people they had misled alongside me. By the time everything was in place, the plan felt less like an act of retaliation and more like a closing statement. I knew exactly what would happen, in what order, and why. I knew how I would speak, how I would stand, and when I would walk away. The outcome, whatever emotional fallout followed, would be grounded in truth. They believed the wedding day would secure their positions, him as the respected husband, her as the devoted friend. They never considered that it could also be the moment when those roles dissolved completely. That miscalculation was not accidental. It was born from arrogance and reinforced by my earlier trust. As the date approached, I felt something I hadn't felt since before the discovery: steadiness. Not hope in the old sense, but confidence in my ability to see things through. The plan was set. The evidence was ready. And the stage they had relied on was about to become the place where everything they hid would finally be revealed. The morning of the wedding arrived quietly. There was no storm, no dramatic interruption, no sense that the day itself knew what was coming. Sunlight filtered through the curtains as it always did, steady and unremarkable. I remember noticing how calm everything felt, and how different that calm was from the anxious excitement I had once imagined. This was not anticipation. It was readiness. I moved through the early hours deliberately, following the schedule I had reviewed countless times. Hair, makeup, dress. Each step was familiar, almost procedural. The people around me commented on how composed I seemed, how grounded. Someone joked that I must have nerves of steel. I smiled politely and let the comment pass. What they saw as calm was simply certainty. There is a particular stillness that comes when you know exactly what you are going to do and why. As I was getting ready, my phone buzzed with messages. My fiancé sent a short note about how much he loved me, how excited he was to finally marry me. My best friend followed shortly after, telling me I looked beautiful and reminding me how proud she was to stand beside me. I read both messages once and put the phone down. There was no urge to respond. Words, at that point, felt unnecessary. The ceremony itself unfolded smoothly. I walked down the aisle aware of every step, every face turned toward me. I noticed how confidently my fiancé stood at the altar, how comfortably my best friend smiled from her place nearby. They looked exactly as they had planned to look, polished, secure, untroubled. I wondered, briefly, if either of them felt even a flicker of unease. If they did, they hid it well. I said my vows clearly, not because they were still true, but because clarity mattered. I kept my voice steady, my expression composed. I watched him mirror my tone, repeating promises he had already broken without hesitation. The contrast wasn't lost on me. There is something deeply revealing about watching someone commit to a lie in front of witnesses. By the time we reached the reception, I felt strangely detached, as though I were both participant and observer. Guests mingled, glasses clinked, music filled the space. My best friend stayed close, checking in, making sure I was enjoying myself. My fiancé played his role flawlessly, greeting relatives, laughing easily, basking in the approval of the room. They believed the hardest part was over. In reality, it hadn't begun yet. I waited for the right moment. Timing was everything. I didn't want interruption or confusion. I wanted attention, focused, collective attention, without force. When dinner plates were cleared and the room naturally settled, I caught the DJ's eye and nodded. He lowered the music just enough. I stood, smoothing my dress, and accepted the microphone he offered. The room grew quiet in that effortless way it does when people expect something celebratory. I could feel the weight of their attention, warm and curious. I thanked everyone for coming, for supporting us, for believing in the values the day was meant to represent. I spoke slowly, allowing each word to land. I talked about honesty, loyalty, and trust, not as abstract ideals, but as commitments we make publicly and privately. Then I signaled to the screen behind me. What appeared wasn't sensational. There were no dramatic sound effects, no commentary, just images. Messages with dates and names clearly visible. Hotel confirmations. Words that spoke for themselves. The room didn't react immediately. It took a moment for recognition to spread, for people to understand what they were seeing. Confusion gave way to realization, realization to silence. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain beyond what was necessary. I let the evidence remain on display long enough for comprehension to settle fully. I glanced briefly at my fiancé. His color had drained. My best friend stared at the screen, then at me, her expression frozen somewhere between disbelief and panic. For the first time since I had known the truth, they looked unprepared. I said only what needed to be said. That the people involved were exactly who they appeared to be in the messages. That the behavior documented there had been ongoing. That I would not be continuing a marriage built on deception. I thanked everyone again, for their presence, for their attention, and handed the microphone back. In that moment, the plan moved from preparation to reality. There was no undoing it, no softening it. The truth had been placed where it belonged, fully visible, without commentary or distortion. I felt an unexpected sense of relief wash over me, not because it was over, but because I had followed through. As I stepped away from the center of the room, I understood something clearly. Execution isn't about drama. It's about alignment. Every action I took that day matched my intention. I hadn't lashed out. I hadn't hidden. I had simply allowed their choices to stand where everyone could see them. What happened next, the confrontation, the fallout, the collapse of the roles they had carefully maintained, was no longer something I needed to control. The plan had done its work. And for the first time in weeks, I felt entirely present, grounded in the certainty that justice, once set in motion, has a momentum all its own. The moment they realized everything had been exposed was nothing short of surreal. My fiancé's confident smile vanished first. It wasn't replaced by shame or guilt, at least, not immediately, but by a pale, stunned realization that the world had just shifted beneath him. He opened his mouth to speak, to protest, to explain, but no words came out. Instead, his eyes darted from the screen to me, searching for some hidden excuse, some context that could absolve him. There was none. My best friend's reaction was equally striking. She went from feigned composure to outright panic in less than a heartbeat. Her carefully constructed persona, the one that had been so polished, so reassuring, so endearing, crumbled visibly. I could see the gears turning behind her eyes, rapid calculations, desperate thoughts about how to recover. She realized, too late, that the audience she had hoped to charm now fully understood the depth of her betrayal. The room was quiet, heavy with the weight of realization. Family members exchanged glances, friends whispered softly, and I could feel the collective judgment settling into the space like a tangible presence. For the first time, the people they had believed would always admire and forgive them were seeing the truth in its entirety. No smiles. No softening. No excuses. Just undeniable evidence. My fiancé tried to reach for me, perhaps expecting me to temper the moment, to contain the fallout, to forgive quietly as I had before. But I stepped aside, maintaining a composed distance. I didn't shout. I didn't plead. I simply let the truth stand in the room, letting their own words and actions speak louder than any confrontation could. The power of their realization came from what they had done, not from my commentary. There was a fleeting attempt from my best friend to interject. She muttered something about a misunderstanding, a joke taken too far, a lapse in judgment. But her voice faltered, drowned out by the murmurs of those around her, and by the undeniable clarity of the evidence displayed for everyone to see. The shock was total. The audience didn't need persuasion. They could see the betrayal as plainly as I could. As their panic mounted, their carefully constructed image disintegrated. My fiancé's hands shook slightly, betraying the composure he had relied on for months. He realized that every lie, every deceitful arrangement, every casual dismissal of my presence and trust had come back to him in full view of the people who mattered most. He was powerless, stripped of the narrative he had relied upon to protect himself. My best friend's downfall was even more immediate. She had built her social capital on the pretense of loyalty, of devotion, of support. Now, in front of everyone she wanted to impress, her duplicity was undeniable. Her influence vanished in an instant. The people who had once looked up to her, admired her, and trusted her instinctively now regarded her with a mixture of astonishment and disbelief. She had positioned herself as indispensable, and yet here she was, completely exposed. The most satisfying part, though, wasn't the shock itself. It was watching the arrogance crumble into vulnerability. Their attempts to explain, to justify, to reclaim control were met with quiet, unyielding eyes from the room. The people who had been witnesses to their duplicity didn't need to be told what to feel. They already knew. The power had shifted entirely. The pedestal my fiancé and my best friend had placed themselves upon had collapsed, and there was no ladder back up. In that moment, I understood fully the nature of karmic justice. It wasn't a matter of theatrics or revenge for its own sake. It was the direct consequence of choices made, of boundaries ignored, of arrogance trusted as armor. The downfall wasn't engineered by me. It was the natural result of their own actions finally meeting exposure. I was merely the catalyst who allowed the truth to take its rightful place. As I stepped back and allowed them to face the reality they had so thoroughly underestimated, I felt a profound clarity. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about accountability. They had acted without consequence for so long, believing themselves clever, untouchable, above reproach. And now, in a single, undeniable revelation, they were exactly where their actions had destined them. Powerless, exposed, and unmistakably accountable. The room was still, heavy with the weight of revelation. Every eye was on them, and every mind seemed to process the betrayal in its own way. I could feel the energy shift, subtle but absolute, an invisible current moving from disbelief to judgment. This was the moment I had prepared for, the culmination of weeks of careful planning, of documenting evidence, and of waiting for them to reveal themselves fully. The payoff was no longer theoretical. It was here. I turned slightly, gesturing toward the screen one final time, ensuring that everyone understood the full scope. The evidence, the messages, the dates, the hotel bookings, the voice notes, was laid out clearly. No emotion-laden commentary, no hyperbolic accusations. The facts spoke for themselves, crisp, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. I watched as realization sank in on the crowd. What had been private betrayal had now become public truth. My fiancé's face was a mixture of shock, shame, and disbelief. His usual confidence, the carefully constructed persona of a charming, devoted partner, had evaporated. Every smirk, every dismissive remark he had relied on, every assumption that I would remain silent, had crumbled. He realized, painfully and acutely, that he had underestimated not me, but the consequences of his own actions. The room itself seemed to emphasize his helplessness. Whispers of astonishment and quiet murmurs underscored the finality of his exposure. Beside him, my best friend was a study in disbelief. Her carefully crafted image, the one she had polished for years, was now shattered. The trust she had exploited, the role she had assumed as my confidant and moral support, evaporated in an instant. The smug confidence that had fueled her arrogance was replaced by panic, confusion, and the dawning understanding that she was, for the first time, truly powerless. Every relationship she thought was solid now wavered. Every word she had used to manipulate others backfired spectacularly. And yet, amid the shock and the whispered conversations, there was a strange serenity in the room. People weren't screaming, laughing cruelly, or attacking. They were absorbing the truth, and the power of evidence allowed that absorption to speak louder than any dramatics could. I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, not vengeance, not gloating, but an equilibrium restored. The scales had finally balanced. I stepped forward, addressing both of them in a calm, measured voice. This is the truth. This is the reality you chose to create. And I will not participate in it any longer. Those words were the simple punctuation to a complex narrative. They weren't meant to wound emotionally. They were meant to define boundaries clearly. They weren't meant to humiliate. They were meant to clarify that I would not be complicit in a life built on deception. For the first time, they looked at me not as the person they could manipulate, not as the compliant partner, not as the forgiving friend, but as someone fully aware, fully prepared, and fully in control. That recognition, more than the evidence itself, solidified the shift in power. The audience, family, friends, and even acquaintances, understood, even silently, that the reversal was complete. What had been a carefully hidden hierarchy of influence was now transparent. What had been manipulation was now documented fact. The room's energy shifted yet again, subtly, as people processed their own responses. Some faces softened with empathy toward me. Others narrowed with judgment aimed squarely at the betrayers. The clarity of the moment was unmistakable. The deception had been laid bare, and accountability was unavoidable. Their calculated arrogance collided with reality, and reality won effortlessly. Finally, I allowed myself a moment of release. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't accompanied by tears or loud triumph. It was quiet, a deep breath, a settling of the shoulders, a recognition that the moment I had envisioned, prepared for, and executed had arrived exactly as intended. The truth was now public. The deception had been exposed. And the people who had relied on secrecy to shield their arrogance were powerless before the consequences they had sown themselves. In that room, in that moment, justice was served, not through chaos or vengeance, but through clarity, truth, and well-timed action. It was satisfying, complete, and absolute. I had not only protected myself, but I had restored equilibrium to the situation in a way that was fair, deliberate, and unassailable. The payoff was exacting, appropriate, and unforgettable. The days after the wedding were quieter than I expected. There was no dramatic chase, no angry confrontations beyond that day, but the effects of what had been revealed rippled through everyone's lives in subtle and permanent ways. Life, once so tangled in betrayal and secrecy, had begun to untangle itself, leaving clarity where confusion once reigned. My fiancé retreated almost immediately. Family members and friends, now fully aware of the truth, began to limit contact, offering polite distance instead of tacit support. He tried, briefly, to explain, to justify, to claim misunderstanding, but the carefully documented evidence left no room for reinterpretation. Every explanation fell flat. Every excuse rebounded off the walls of credibility I had built with the messages, recordings, and timelines. He had been confident once, but in this new reality, his arrogance was meaningless. The only thing left for him was reflection, a forced reckoning with the consequences of his own choices. My best friend faced an equally irreversible shift. Those who had once admired her closeness with me and her charm as a social navigator now looked at her differently. Invitations became scarce. Trust, once her currency, evaporated. She realized, too late, that influence built on deceit is always precarious. The relationship she had counted on to buffer her downfall had dissipated, leaving her to face the social and emotional consequences alone. I did not need to speak for her demise. The truth had spoken loudly enough for her to experience the full weight of her own actions. As for me, life slowly regained a sense of normalcy that had been impossible in the months leading up to the wedding. There was relief in waking up without the knot of anxiety in my stomach, in seeing the world as it truly was, rather than as a carefully curated illusion. I took control of my own schedule, my own finances, and my own social life. The clarity of the past weeks had restored my sense of agency. I no longer doubted myself or my judgment. I had navigated betrayal, exposed wrongdoing, and emerged intact, stronger and wiser. I stayed friends with those who had supported me without judgment, who had witnessed the events and responded with care and understanding. These relationships felt lighter, more authentic, and deeply grounded in mutual respect. I realized that part of justice isn't merely punishment. It's creating a life where boundaries are clear, where honesty is non-negotiable, and where respect is reciprocal. There were moments of reflection. Naturally, I thought about the choices I had made, the restraint I had exercised, and the careful planning that had led to the perfect execution of truth. I recognized that the most satisfying aspect of the entire ordeal wasn't the shock or the embarrassment of the betrayers, it was the affirmation that integrity, patience, and strategic action could restore balance. Karma, I realized, often simply needs a hand to guide it. In the end, the new normal was steady and grounded. My life moved forward, free from manipulation and deceit. I retained my dignity, my relationships, and my sense of self. The wedding, which had been intended as a stage for betrayal, became the catalyst for a complete reordering of truth, responsibility, and consequence. My ex-fiancé and former best friend faced the inevitable consequences of their actions, socially, emotionally, and personally. They had lost the pedestal they assumed was secure. The very arrogance that had fueled their betrayal had catalyzed their downfall. For me, life returned to its rhythms, but with a new layer of understanding, that justice, when approached deliberately and executed with precision, doesn't need spectacle, it simply needs truth. And truth, once revealed, carries a weight that cannot be ignored or undone. I walked into each day aware of that weight, but no longer burdened by it. I had been wronged, yes, but I had also restored balance. The lesson lingered clearly: deception and betrayal have consequences, and the careful, patient revelation of truth is the most enduring form of justice.